Hi, my name is Kevin Jones, and I'm from Rock Solid Knowledge. And welcome to this talk on using the Rock Solid Knowledge SAML template to create an identity provider for OpenIddict. So OpenIddict is an open source framework that can be used to add both OIDC client and OIDC server support to your applications. And Rock Solid Knowledge provides a component to add SAML support to OpenIddict. Rock Solid Knowledge also provides a .NET template to allow us to create a SAML identity provider on top of OpenIddict. To show this identity provider in action, we also need a service provider. And in previous talks on this channel, we've created a service provider. So in this talk, we'll create an identity provider, and then we'll use the service provider from a previous talk to communicate with that identity provider. Let's go and see how we can use this template. Okay, so we have to install the template. So first of all, let's check the templates installed on the system. And to do that, we run .NET new list. And that just delivers a list of the templates. And at the end here, we can see we have one RSK template, but we don't have the OpenIddict template. So if I clear the screen, then I can install the template. And then to do that, we run .NET new install rsk.saml.openiddict.template. And this should install version 2 of the template. And we can see that it has done that. So now that we've installed that template, we can use it to create a project. But before I do that, I want to create a solution, then create the project, and then add that project into the solution. So to create the solution, I can say .NET new, and then type the name of the template I want to use, which is just solution. And then we can name this generated solution. And let's just call that SAML. So that creates a solution file for me. And then we can add a project based on the template. And to create that project, we use .NET new, and then the name of the template. And that is SAML plus OpenIddict. And we can give that a name, and let's name it IDP. And we also have to tell the template which database we're going to use. To do that, we have the -db provider option. On this machine, I'm using MySQL, so I specify that here. If you are using SQL Server, you just say SQL Server here. And that now goes away and generates a project for me based on that template. So as my IDE, I'm using Rider, and I've opened that solution file inside Rider. And then into this, I need to add that existing project, which is just idp.csproj. So inside here, there are a few things we have to edit. So first of all, let me look at startup.cs, and we can see inside startup.cs how this project is being configured. So I'm using MySQL, and we pass to MySQL this default connection string. We're using OpenIddict, so you have a call to use OpenIddict. And then further down here, we configure the SAML component. And this is the Rock Solid Knowledge SAML component. Now, even with that in place, there are a couple of things we have to add. So for example, I need to add this connection string. And that connection string is in my appsettings.json file. So if we open that up, where it says add your connection string here, I'll replace that with the MySQL connection string I'm using. I notice for this, I have a database called OpenIddict, which I've created inside MySQL, but currently there are no table definitions inside that database. And we'll fix that in a moment. I also need a license key. Now, as we are using the Rock Solid Knowledge SAML component, I need to get a license key for that component. To get a license, I need to go to OpenIddictComponents.com and then enter my first name, last name, and email address. And then Rock Solid Knowledge will send out a license key. So I did this a few minutes ago, so I won't duplicate that here. Once I have the license key, if I go into licensekey.cs, my license E will be demo, and the license key will be whatever value Rock Solid Knowledge sent to me. And again, I'll just copy that value into this file. So once we have those two things in place, I can now generate the migrations to use for the database. So from the command line, I'm making sure I'm in the right directory, which is the directory that contains this project. I can generate these migrations. So the project has 4 different DB contexts. So there are 4 sets of migrations we have to generate. To generate the migrations, we use the .NET command line, so .NET EF migrations. The first context is the application DB context. The second is this OpenIddict SAML message DB context. The third is the SAML configuration DB context. And then finally, there's a SAML artifact DB context. With those migrations in place, I can then apply them to my database. To do that, we run update against each of these migrations. So first of all, we update the application DB context. Then the OpenIddict SAML message DB context. The SAML configuration DB context. And finally, the SAML artifact DB context. So now that those are in place, we need to seed the database with configuration information for this identity provider. So things like a client and a user, for example. So let's go and do that now. So the way that's done in the template is that we have this file called worker.cs. And notice worker.cs implements iHosted service. And if I look in startup.cs and scroll down to the end here, we see we have this call to services.add hosted service, and we add this worker hosted service. Now, as the comment said, in a real world application, this step will be part of a setup script. And it's in this step that we're going to add a client, we're going to add a user, and we're going to add a service provider. So inside worker.cs, we have some helper functions to add things like test users and to add things like service providers. For our test user, I just need to fill in the username, the email, and the password. So for my test user, let's create a user with a username of bob@test.fake. And then we'll also use the username as the email. And for the password, let's give them a password of password123 ! Further down in the code here, we see there's a call to create test user. This checks to see if the user already exists, and if it doesn't, adds that test user into the database. So as well as the user, we also need to add a client that we're using for testing, and we need to add a service provider that we're using for testing as well. Remember, the service provider is the other half of SAML. This is our identity provider, and it's the service provider that will call into us to do authentication. So within this code, there are methods to add service providers and clients. So if I scroll down, we'll see there's a create client if not exists, and a create service provider if not exists. So I simply need to call those with the appropriate information. So let me create a couple of helper methods here that we'll await on. One will be called create test client, and we'll pass the service scope to that in the same way that we pass it to create test user. And I also want a function called create test service provider. And we'll generate both of these and then write the code inside them. So let's do create test client first of all. So we have a helper method called create client if not exists. And this expects 3 parameters. It expects the scope. It expects what's known as the client ID, and that's the value we use to identify this client. And then it expects some configuration for that client. And that configuration we pass as an action into this call. So let me define the client ID first of all. And for this, I'll use a URL. And that URL is going to be https localhost, the port our client will run on, which is port 5003. And then to identify it as a SAML client, we'll use /SAML. And we'll also use this client ID in the service provider, and we'll see that a little later. So into create client if not exists, I need to pass this OpenIddict application descriptor. And this needs a couple of values. In here, we need to specify the client ID again. So we set that equal to client ID. And then we also need to specify the permissions this client will need. And to that, I'm going to add a permission, and that's permissions.scopes.email. This is an async call, so we need to await on it to create the client. For my service provider, this is where we configure the SAML service provider. And again, this is similar. There's a helper method called create service provider if not exists. Again, it's an async method, so we await on it. Again, it takes a scope, which we just passed through. It also needs the entity ID, which we'll define in a moment. And finally, it needs some configuration. And we'll come back and fill in that configuration in a sec. So I'll define the entity ID again here, as we'll use this in a couple of places. And we set the entity ID and the client ID to be the same value. When we call create service provider if not exists, I need to tell it how to configure this service provider. Again, to do that, we use this configuration object. We specify the entity ID again. We can set some flags inside here, and I'm going to turn off encryption and signing. So I'm going to say encrypt insertions equals false. I'm going to say sign assertions equals false. And I'm also going to say require authentication request signed equals false. Now, if I don't turn these off, I would also need to specify a certificate and a private key. So I'm just doing this here to make my life easier. You probably want to enable these and specify the certificate to use and the private key to use to encrypt and sign your assertions. With these flags set, I now need to configure two things. I configure what's known as my assertion consumer service. So to do that, I say conf.assertions consumer service. And this takes a list of service objects. So I can use the square brackets notation to set this up. And then inside here, do new service. And this service is going to take two parameters. It's going to tell us how to bind to this service. And we're going to use HTTP post. So I say SAML constants dot binding types dot HTTP post. And it also takes an endpoint. And this will be the endpoint on my service provider that we are going to talk to from the identity provider. And again, we'll configure this in two places. We'll configure it here in the IDP, and it will also be configured in the SP. So the value for that is going to be HTTPS localhost 5003, which will be the port my service provider runs on, and then /signin -SAML -OpenIddict. With the assertion consumer service configured, I also configure the single logout service. So where do I go to when we log out our service provider? Again, that's a collection of services. And again, in here, we'll create one service. Again, we specify the binding. That will be SAML constants.binding types. But this time, we're going to use HTTP redirect. And then we specify the URL to go to when our user signs out. Again, it's going to be HTTPS localhost port 5003. But this time, it will be signout-SAML. And with that done, we can run our server. And when we run the server, it will execute our worker, and it will use the information in the worker to seed the database. So that's the IDP now running. Now the next step is to run the service provider and have that service provider connect to this identity provider. So let's see how we do that. To test that the identity provider works, we need a service provider. And I've added in the service provider from our previous videos. I've had to change a couple of things, but only addresses. So in this example, my service provider is running on localhost 5003, whereas the identity provider is running on localhost 5001. So in the service provider's program CS, we set the identity provider metadata address to be localhost 5001. And then in our service provider options, we set our identity ID to be HTTPS localhost port 5003. And notice things like /SAML, /SAML-OpenIddict match the values we set for the entity ID in the identity provider. We also have to have the licensee and the license key here, and you can use the same one that you use for the identity provider. So if I run this service provider, we end up at the home screen. If I click on details, the URL for details is a protected resource, and it's going to ask me to log in. So if I click on details, I want to log in. And if you remember, we set up our user as bob@test.fake with a password of password123 exclamation mark. And if I click on login, then what the service provider does is it looks inside the claims and it displays those claims. And again, if you want more information, how to write this service provider, there is a video on this channel that does that. The important point here is that we've used the template to create the identity provider. We have to configure that with the information that we need to see the database. And then we can use our service provider against that identity provider. So thank you for listening. I hope you found that useful. If you want the code for both the identity provider and the service provider, then they're on GitHub at https://github.com/Kevin R. Jones/OpenIddict-RSK-SAML-template. Thank you.